All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating philosophical framework about how the very systems we build to judge each other, the legal, economic, and educational ones we deal with every single day, actually run a massive risk of erasing our fundamental humanity. These systems are absolutely everywhere, and yeah, we totally need them. But there's a hidden danger lurking in how they operate. So we're going to explore a vital concept called the human floor. It's essentially the moral bridge behind humanity. And honestly, it might just save us from being swallowed up by our own categories.
What's so interesting and honestly kind of scary about this idea is how incredibly easy it is for a totally useful label within a system to just eclipse the actual human being. I mean, think about terms like defendant, employee, voter, or even unproductive. Systems literally demand that we categorize people just to make the world manageable, right? A court has to see a defendant. A business has to see an employee. But the real question is, when does that necessary label turn into a blindfold? At what point do we just stop seeing the human entirely?
To wrap our heads around this, we're going to walk through a really clear, logical flow today. We'll start with the trap of systems, then look at building the moral bridge, break down local versus total judgments, dive into the positional reversal test, and wrap up with keeping the human visible.
First up, let's talk about the trap of systems.
Okay, so we have to acknowledge the reality we all live in. Human life is absolutely saturated with oughts, right? People ought to obey the law. The most qualified person ought to get the job. Wrongdoers ought to be punished. And to enforce all these competing oughts, we build these massive, complex systems. But here's the crucial point from the source material. Simplifying reality into categories like winners or losers is totally necessary for institutions to actually do anything. I mean, a university has to decide who gets accepted. But it creates a dangerous trap. The abstraction literally swallows the person. Suddenly, you aren't a complex human being who just didn't get the job. You're just labeled unqualified. You aren't a person who made a mistake. You're just the offender. The category becomes more real to the system than, well, your actual heartbeat.
Moving on to Part 2, Building the Moral Bridge.
So how do we actually build a defense against this institutional dehumanization? The source text proposes something called the human floor, and this brilliantly illustrates our core focus today, the minimal bridge principle. Now, I know that sounds a bit academic, but the concept itself is incredibly profound. It basically means we have to actively maintain a moral bridge between the biological fact that we are human and the norms or rules we create. The fact that a person is a living, breathing human being cannot just magically disappear from the justification of a rule. If we're making rules for humans, their fundamental humanity has to stay front and center in the equation.
Now, the key takeaway here is that this floor doesn't demand equal outcomes for everyone. It doesn't pretend we're all equally virtuous, equally skilled, or equally responsible. It's a starting point, not a ceiling. A dangerous person might still need to be restrained, right? A highly skilled person is still going to get that promotion. The floor simply dictates that none of those conclusions require us to pretend that the person who loses or fails or does wrong has somehow fallen completely out of the human species. It's a foundational constraint on how we even reason about people.
Which brings us to our third point, local versus total judgments. This is a vital distinction because it allows us to legitimately evaluate each other without completely wrecking that human floor. A local judgment is relative to the system. So, saying person A performed worse on a math test or person B is less qualified for a coding job, that's entirely valid. The mistake, the really dangerous trap, happens when that perfectly valid local judgment is silently twisted into a totalizing conclusion. Like the idea that because person A failed a test, they are somehow a lesser human being. Failing a test does not reduce your human worth. It literally just means you failed a test.
But wait, shouldn't our moral worth be based on things like intelligence or courage or empathy? Well, the source pushes back on this with a theorem of moral ambivalence. We actually can't base human worth on capacities because capacities are morally ambivalent. Think about it. Intelligence can be used to cure a disease, sure, but it can also be directed toward orchestrating a highly sophisticated financial fraud. Discipline can build a home, or it can make systematic cruelty way more efficient. Capability simply does not equal goodness. When you really dismantle these alternative floors, it becomes crystal clear why basic humanity is the only stable foundation for moral reasoning. Let's play this out. If our moral worth is based on intelligence, what happens as we age or if we suffer a cognitive injury? If it's based on productivity, what happens during an economic collapse or when someone develops a disability? Citizenship? Well, that can be lost in an instant. Refugees prove this to us every single day. Even virtue fluctuates.
Basic humanity is literally the only floor that stays intact when people are at their absolute most vulnerable. And let's be real, a floor designed only for when we're at our strongest isn't really much of a floor at all.
Let's move into our fourth section, the positional reversal test.
Okay, now that we've got the theory down, let's explore a truly brilliant empathy test designed to discipline the rules and systems we support. I want you to genuinely ask yourself this question because it forcefully exposes these quiet, self-exempting assumptions we all make. Usually, a harsh rule seems incredibly reasonable to us because we secretly just assume it's only ever going to apply to somebody else. But human circumstances are wildly uncertain. Wealth, health, status, they can vanish overnight. Would you still support that rigid penalty or that totally unforgiving bureaucratic process if it were your own child standing underneath the weight of it?
This rhythmic contrast reveals something profoundly important. Pay attention to the word "and." A person can be unqualified and human. They can be wrong and human. Now, terrible conduct might drastically change the justified response. A dangerous person might need to go to prison, absolutely, but it does not change the species of the moral subject being judged. When metaphor becomes classification, when we start calling criminals monsters or political opponents vermin, we are psychologically rewriting the rules of how they can be treated. The human floor absolutely refuses to allow that transformation.
And finally, Section 5, keeping the human visible. So how do we actually take this personal attitude, this moral bridge, and turn it into actionable institutional discipline? Because today, we're governed by vast, faceless institutions, not just individual interactions. Well, the first institutional rule is this: means matter just as much as ends. Even if a government or a massive corporation has a morally attractive objective like public safety or educational excellence, it cannot use arbitrary coercion, indiscriminate punishment, or humiliation to get there. Why? Because the human is still a human while the system is acting upon them. The destination doesn't justify running over people on the road to get there.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, these practical safeguards form a sort of checklist. It's meant to prevent bureaucracies, courts, and even automated AI systems from engaging in structural dehumanization. It means demanding individual consideration instead of just throwing out blanket policies. It means proportionality. Just because a penalty is justified doesn't mean any degree of penalty is justified, right? It means mandatory opportunities for review and appeal, because institutions are super fallible and make mistakes all the time. These procedures literally force the system to stop treating living, breathing people merely as data points, risks, or administrative burdens.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Systems are made for humans. They are not substitutes for them. The next time you have to navigate the institutions that organize our world, whether you're making the rules, enforcing them, or honestly just trying to survive them, really ask yourself, are you allowing the label, the score, or the category to become the whole story? I urge you to always keep the human visible and actively protect that moral bridge behind humanity.